The fluorescent lights inside Duke University Hospital in Durham, North Carolina, burned with a sterile brightness that seemed determined to expose every secret of the night. The air in the trauma bay smelled of antiseptic sweat and the sharp, metallic bite of fear. The gurney in the center of the room carried the limp form of a young soldier, Private First Class Rachel Whitman. Just 19 years old, her skin pale, her lips cracked and blue, her uniform clinging to her body stiff with frost. The monitor beside her bed gave off the merciless straight line of death, an unbroken signal that mocked every desperate attempt the medical team had made to pull her back. A nurse called out with urgency code blue, and suddenly the room erupted with controlled chaos. Sneakers squeaked across the tile floor, drawers slammed open. The crash cart rattled forward like salvation on wheels. Doctor Alan Cooper, an attending physician seasoned in emergencies, bent over Rachel with determination, even as a shadow of dread pressed against his jaw. He barked out the first order 1 milligram epinephrine IV push, now clear. The paddles pressed against her chest, and the first shock jolted her thin body into the air, her back arching violently before she slumped again into stillness. The monitor flickered a cruel tease and snapped back into flat silence. Another shock clear. Again, her body jumped the smell of ozone filling the air like the aftermath of a lightning strike, but still the line refused to change. Dr. Cooper's jaw tightened, sweat rolling down despite the cool air conditioning. A third time clear. The defibrillator crackled, the jolt surged through her chest, and for one long heartbeat, the room fell into silence. A silence so heavy the nurses dared not even breathe. Then a fragile tremor appeared on the screen, tiny peaks weak and irregular but real. "We have a pulse!" a nurse shouted. Relief spread across the room, tentative, fragile, as if none of them dared believe it could hold. Rachel's chest rose unevenly under the oxygen mask air forced into lungs that had nearly surrendered. Her eyelids fluttered open, lashes crusted with frost eyes, unfocused at first, then sharp enough to find the ceiling lights blazing above. Dr. Cooper bent close, his voice low but urgent. "Private Whitman, can you hear me? You were gone for 2 minutes. You came back against all odds." She tried to swallow, but her throat burned raw. Each word dragged out like sand scraping stone. With barely more than a breath, she whispered, "He strangled me with a belt. My mom just watched." The words cut through the air, sharper than any scalpel. Nurses froze in place, Dr. Cooper's pen halted in mid-note. Those words carried a truth that was heavier than the flat line of her heart, a truth that spoke not of accident, but of betrayal. The monitor tapped out a weak rhythm, a fragile lifeline as the team moved quickly to stabilize. Her heated blankets spread across her body, warm IV fluids connected. A probe slipped in to measure her core temperature. 29 degrees Celsius, a nurse reported voice, clipped and serious. Severe hypothermia. Minutes away from irreversible shutdown. The room smelled of blood from cracked lips and raw knuckles mixed with the sharpness of alcohol wipes. The smell of survival clawed back from the edge. Rachel's body told a story in bruises and frost wrists purpled by hands that had gripped too hard. Knuckles split from beating against steel patches of frostbite creeping across her cheeks and ears. None of it matched any version of an accident. It was cruelty carved into flesh. Dr. Cooper glanced at the clock. 3:10 in the morning. She had died and been pulled back, but the real horror was not the flatline. It was the whispered confession. "He strangled me with a belt. My mom just watched." For a second, the only sound was the weak blip of the monitor. Everyone in the room understood they had not just saved a life. They had stepped into something darker, something no one wanted to believe, yet could no longer deny. Rachel's lips moved again under the mask, words too faint to catch. Later, when her strength returned, she would repeat them, but even now, the weight of her broken voice pressed on every ear. Why would a young soldier nearly freeze to death in her own backyard? Why would her mother stand silent? The questions clung heavier than the antiseptic air. Dr. Cooper steadied his voice, Keep warming her watch for arrhythmia. She is not out of danger. Yet inside his chest he carried the unspoken vow, protect this girl, protect her story. The tension swelled again as Rachel's pulse skipped on the monitor, irregular, teasing another collapse. A nurse squeezed the oxygen bag. Her chest rose reluctantly. The monitor beeped a pause, then resumed. Relief swept through the team like a tide. Emotional whiplash struck the room again. Death's shadow lingered just behind them. Then came the twist that locked everyone in place. Rachel forced her swollen eyes open, gaze glassy but fierce, and with effort pulled enough air through the mask to whisper a second time louder, now each syllable torn from the rawness of her throat. He strangled me. My mom stood there. The words hung heavy, undeniable, and this time the team did not move. They looked at one another eyes wide, knowing they had just heard testimony of a crime. The monitor continued its fragile rhythm proof that she still lived, but the true weight was in her confession. The hook had sunk not just into the story of a dying soldier, but into the hearts of every witness in that sterile room. It was no longer only about survival. It was about betrayal, silence, and the kind of cruelty that forces even seasoned doctors to swallow hard and steady their hands. By the time Rachel's eyes drifted shut again, not unconscious but exhausted, the room carried more than medical urgency. It carried the promise that this night, this near death, was not an end, but a beginning. The first chapter of a story that demanded to be told. Rachel Whitman had been born in Wilmington, North Carolina, a coastal city known for its beaches and military ties. But for her childhood, the beauty of the ocean never reached inside the walls of her family home. From the earliest memories she could recall, Rachel lived in a house where silence was demanded, where love was conditional, and where her mother's eyes always turned toward her older brother Jason, as if he were the center of the universe. Their mother, Linda Whitman, worked long hours at a small nail salon on the edge of town, painting and filing to keep the bills barely paid. She was 45 years old, hardened by disappointment, and driven by an unshakable belief that her son was destined for greatness, even though he never showed it. To Linda, Jason was the golden child, and every mistake he made was either excused or shifted onto someone else, most often onto Rachel. Jason, 3 years older, grew into a young man with broad shoulders and a mean streak that only deepened with alcohol. He drifted through community college without finishing, picked up odd jobs and lost them, and spent most nights on Ramsey Street in Fayetteville, slouched at bars with a beer in hand, his voice rising when the whiskey took hold. To the neighbors, he was just another young man struggling to find his way. To Rachel, he was a storm always waiting to break. Rachel's earliest achievements never seemed to matter. At 10 years old, she won a spelling bee at school, proud of the blue ribbon she carried home. She imagined for one moment that her mother might smile, might hang it on the fridge. Instead, Linda waved it away, muttering that Jason needed the attention more since he was struggling at school. At 12, Rachel begged to join a local soccer team. Linda told her no, the family car was needed for Jason's part-time shifts at the gas station shifts he abandoned after 2 weeks. At 15, Rachel saved money from babysitting and bought her first cell phone. One evening, Jason smashed it against the wall during an argument, and Linda's only response was to scold Rachel for provoking her brother. The words "do not provoke him" became a kind of family law, repeated so often that it echoed in Rachel's mind even when no one spoke. Growing up under that weight meant Rachel learned to swallow her voice. She cooked, she cleaned, she avoided confrontation, and she did everything to keep peace in a house where peace never lasted. She became invisible inside her own family, and invisibility was supposed to keep her safe. Yet invisibility became its own prison. By 16, Rachel realized if she stayed in that house, she would suffocate. She watched the uniformed recruiters who came to her high school, listened to their promises of honor and purpose, and saw in their eyes something she had never seen at home: respect. She signed her papers for the delayed entry program before her 17th birthday, knowing that the day she turned 18, she would leave Wilmington not as Linda's overlooked daughter, not as Jason's scapegoat, but as Private Whitman. The transition was brutal, but it was salvation. At Fort Jackson in South Carolina, the drill sergeants shouted at her until her lungs burned, pushed her until her muscles trembled, but for the first time in her life, the harsh voices meant growth instead of degradation. One sergeant told her, "Private Whitman, you do not quit. You adapt. You overcome." Those words struck her harder than any insult Jason had ever thrown, but in a way that lifted her instead of crushing her. They were words she carried like armor. At graduation from basic training, she stood straighter than she ever had. Her uniform pressed. Her boots shined her family absent from the stands. She did not care. The Army saw her, and that mattered more. At 19, she was assigned to Fort Liberty, the newly renamed base in Fayetteville, North Carolina, only a short drive from the very house she had wanted to escape. The irony cut deep. She could serve her country, wear the flag on her shoulder, and carry the respect of her squad. Yet every leave brought her back to the same suffocating rooms where Linda's eyes hardened and Jason's smirk sharpened. The contrast was sharp and cruel. On base, Rachel was valued for her resilience, praised for running until her lungs burned, for carrying gear heavier than herself. At home, she was mocked as soldier girl, ordered to clean up Jason's messes, told by her mother that the Army had made her arrogant, that she thought she was better than them. If she woke early to train, Linda snapped that she was obsessive. If she stayed late to drill, Linda accused her of avoiding responsibilities. The uniform that gave her pride everywhere else became a target in her own kitchen. Yet Rachel kept coming home on leave. Part of her still longed for recognition, still hoped that her mother would one day look at her with pride instead of contempt, that Jason might see her as more than a punching bag for his insecurities. That hope flared briefly each time she packed her bag to return home, but it was always extinguished before the first meal was done. The memories of childhood lingered too strong. She remembered standing in the kitchen at 12, holding back tears as Jason shoved her shoulder. She remembered Linda's cold stare as she said, "Respect your brother, Rachel, do not make him angry." She remembered every silence that followed every moment when she was left alone to bandage a scrape or hide a bruise. Those memories never left. They simply layered beneath the new scars of adulthood. By the time Rachel entered her 19th year, she had built two identities, the soldier who belonged to something larger and the daughter who remained trapped in a cycle of control and silence. Each time she left base for Fayetteville, she felt the tension coil inside her chest. She braced herself for the shift in air, the way Jason's insults would slither through the living room, the way Linda's voice would cut sharper than knives. She reminded herself she was stronger now, trained now, but inside the house her strength seemed to dissolve. The walls whispered the same old refrain. "Jason matters. You do not." That winter, Rachel returned home again, carrying with her the exhaustion of training, the pride of belonging to her squad, and the hope that perhaps this time might be different. She wore her gray PT uniform like a second skin, partly because it was comfortable, partly because it reminded her that she had worth. She stepped through the door and saw Jason sprawled on the couch with a beer, the television blaring. Linda stood at the stove, her lips pressed tight, glancing at her daughter as though her arrival were an inconvenience. "You are back," Linda said flatly. Rachel swallowed her reply, forcing a polite smile, telling herself she would only stay a few days. She told herself she could endure, but endurance had been her whole life. The backstory of Rachel Whitman was not one of a girl raised in warmth and safety. It was the story of a daughter silenced, of a soldier forged in the fires of both basic training and toxic family ties, of a young woman who carried pride in her service and shame in her bloodline. It was this clash of identities that set the stage for what was to come, because when the night descended in Fayetteville and a simple bowl of soup spilled across the kitchen floor, the years of silence and suppression would erupt into violence that left her lifeless on a gurney, with a nurse shouting into the sterile air, "She's dead." The story of the Whitman household was not built on one night of violence alone. It was written over years, etched into daily routines, casual cruelties, and the unspoken rules that shaped Rachel's childhood and adolescence. Jason Whitman had always been the favored child, even when his choices led him down paths that never produced anything but more disappointment. He was 22 now, older by 3 years, broad-shouldered but sloppy in posture, a man who carried himself as if the world owed him something. He had attended community college for a year, but never finished, drifting from one interest to the next, always armed with excuses. He picked up jobs at construction sites and garages, but his temper and unreliability ensured he never lasted long. Nights usually ended at a bar on Ramsey Street in Fayetteville, where the regulars knew his name and his tab stretched longer than his paycheck. His drinking hardened him, and when the alcohol hit, his frustrations needed an outlet. That outlet was usually Rachel. To Linda Whitman, her son's flaws were invisible. She was 45, her hands stained with nail polish remover and acetone from her long days at the salon, her shoulders permanently hunched from years bent over manicures. Life had not given her the prosperity she imagined, but she clung to one conviction: Jason was her hope. She excused his drinking as stress, his failures as bad luck, his temper as something Rachel provoked. When Jason shouted, Linda's response was never to protect her daughter. It was to scold her for stirring him. "Do not provoke your brother," she would say, words clipped, eyes hard. That phrase became the law of the house. It meant Jason could do what he pleased and Rachel was expected to endure. There were no exceptions. The emotional abuse was constant. When Rachel was 14, Jason smashed her birthday cake into the floor during an argument over nothing. Linda's response was not to reprimand him, but to tell Rachel to stop exaggerating to clean it up and to show gratitude that Jason even came home that night. At 15, when Rachel saved up for her own school trip to Raleigh, Jason demanded the money for himself. Linda told her, "Your brother needs it more, he is struggling." When Rachel resisted, Jason ripped her backpack and Linda scolded her for being selfish. It was always Rachel's fault. Even in the smallest moments, the hierarchy was clear. Jason was served first at meals. Jason was allowed to monopolize the family car. Jason's grades, though poor, were excused while Rachel's achievements were dismissed. The pattern drilled into her head year after year until she barely questioned it. But questioning had been the seed of her eventual rebellion. The physical violence escalated over time. Shoves became slaps. Slaps became fists on rare nights when Jason's anger boiled over. Rachel remembered standing in the hallway at 16, her shoulder throbbing from where Jason had slammed her into the wall. She had tried to tell Linda, tried to explain, but Linda's only words were, "Stop being dramatic, Rachel. You always blow things out of proportion." That night, Rachel wrapped herself in her blanket and whispered silently to herself, promising she would leave. By then, she had already signed her paperwork for the Army. It was her escape route, her ticket out of a house where her worth was invisible. Yet the escape was never complete. Each leave pulled her back. The invisible chains of family still wrapped around her wrists. Every time she returned home, she found herself trapped in the old roles. Jason barked orders. Linda defended him. Rachel obeyed. The scars were more than physical. They were psychological grooves carved deep by repetition. She had been conditioned to believe that silence equaled safety, but silence also meant invisibility. In the Army, Rachel found the opposite. She found structure recognition, even praise. Drill sergeants shouted at everyone equally. Hard work was rewarded. Strength was respected. At Fort Jackson, she had felt like a person for the first time. She ran until her lungs burned and received a nod of approval. She completed obstacle courses and was told she had grit. She carried 50 pounds on her back and discovered she was stronger than she ever knew. Those experiences reshaped her, but they could not erase the past. When she returned to Fayetteville during leave, the old patterns reasserted themselves. Jason sneered soldier girl whenever she walked into the room in uniform. Linda accused her of arrogance, of thinking she was better than the family. Even the habits of discipline that kept her sharp were mocked. If she woke up at dawn for a run, Linda said she was obsessive. If she stayed at the base longer than expected, Linda claimed she was avoiding responsibility. The uniform that commanded respect on base invited ridicule at home. The contradiction gnawed at Rachel. At Fort Liberty, she was part of something larger, a soldier among comrades her resilience celebrated. At home, she was still the invisible daughter, the scapegoat, the one who should apologize for bruises she did not cause. That toxic duality created a constant whiplash in her life. She could not reconcile the pride she felt in service with the shame she felt in her family. She remembered specific flashbacks that haunted her nights. At 10, holding a drawing she made in school, watching Jason rip it to shreds while Linda told her to stop tattling. At 12, begging to join soccer denied so Jason could use the car. At 15, covering a bruise with long sleeves terrified a teacher might ask. each memory stacked on top of the next until the weight became unbearable. It was not just Jason's violence or Linda's silence. It was the cumulative message, "You do not matter." Rachel's enlistment at 18 was an act of defiance, her declaration that she would matter somewhere. She stood on the parade ground at Fort Jackson, sweat-dripping lungs heaving, but she felt alive. She looked around at the other recruits, and for the first time in her life, she was not invisible. Yet the Army could not change the family she was born into. It could only give her tools to survive them. That toxic backstory set the stage for the crisis to come. Jason's temper was not new. Linda's betrayal was not new. The night when a spilled bowl of soup led to Rachel's near death was not an isolated explosion. It was the culmination of years of erosion, each insult and each shove another stone pulled from her foundation. The belt Jason wrapped around her throat that night was not just leather. It was every unpunished cruelty, every silenced scream, every look from her mother that said, "Endure instead of fight back." The backstory of the Whitman family was a slow burn of neglect and violence, and Rachel's survival in the Army only made the contrast sharper. She had two identities pulling her apart. One was the soldier who adapted and overcame. The other was the daughter conditioned to submit. That conflict would explode in the kitchen of their Fayetteville home on a cold winter night, and the world would see the truth that Rachel had lived for 19 years. This was not about spilled soup. It was about a family that chose control over care, silence over truth, and cruelty over love. It was about the invisible daughter finally reaching the breaking point where invisibility was no longer survival. The winter air in Fayetteville had a sharpness that night, the kind of chill that slipped under doors and clung to walls, the kind of cold that made Rachel Whitman pull her Army PT jacket tighter even inside her mother's house. She had returned home from Fort Liberty for a short leave, carrying the exhaustion of endless drills and the quiet pride of belonging to her unit. The gray uniform she wore was not just habit, but a reminder that she had earned a place in something larger. Yet, the moment she stepped into the small kitchen of the Whitman home, the atmosphere pressed down like a weight. Jason sat sprawled on the couch in the next room, a beer in one hand, his eyes glassy and unfocused as the television blared. Linda moved around the stove with her usual brisk efficiency lips pressed tight, her glances at Rachel flat and cold. Rachel had spent most of the evening trying to keep the peace. She had prepared chicken soup, a simple Southern recipe with broth vegetables and tender pieces of meat simmered carefully. Cooking was one of the few acts of control she still clung to when she came home away to create something warm in a house that rarely gave warmth back. She set the table, quietly offered bowls without expectation of thanks, and sat down to eat in silence. Jason was already half drunk. He slurped loudly, muttering insults under his breath that carried just loud enough for Rachel to hear. "Soldier girl, arrogant, thinks she is better than us." Rachel kept her eyes down, spooning the broth, reminding herself she only had a few more days before returning to base. She told herself she could endure. But Jason was not content with muttering. As the evening deepened, his temper flared with each sip of whiskey. When Rachel stood to clear the dishes, Jason lurched to his feet, his broad frame unsteady yet menacing. He stumbled into the kitchen where Rachel rinsed bowls under warm water, her back straight, her shoulders tight with the effort of control. Jason's words slurred, but his intent was sharp. "You missed some, soldier girl," he sneered, pointing at the pot still soaking in the sink. Rachel turned her head slightly, keeping her tone calm. "I'll get to it. It is fine." But her measured voice only ignited him further. Jason slammed his beer can onto the counter foam, spilling over and dripping onto the floor. His face twisted veins standing out at his temple. "You think you can talk back? You think that uniform makes you better than me?" His voice cracked through the small kitchen like thunder. Rachel stiffened her training, whispering in her mind, "Control your breathing, do not let fear show." But fear seeped through her anyway, tightening her chest, quickening her pulse. The sound of his rage was too familiar a nightmare she thought she had left behind, yet found herself reliving. Linda appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her gaze detached, her expression unreadable. She did not intervene. She did not place herself between her children. Instead, she spoke with the flat authority Rachel knew too well. "Apologize to your brother," she said. Rachel's jaw tightened. For years, she had apologized for things she never did: for Jason's mistakes, for his anger, for simply existing. Something inside her refused this time. Her voice shook but held firm. "I am not your maid." The words slipped into the cold air and seemed to freeze it. Jason's eyes widened in disbelief before narrowing with fury. The silence that followed was heavier than any shout. Linda's lips pursed. Her eyes carried the same message as always: do not antagonize him. Jason's hand shot out, clamping around Rachel's wrist. His grip so tight she cried out. "You do not disrespect me in this house," he growled, pulling her toward him, the dishes clattering into the sink as water splashed across the counter. Rachel tried to pry his grip loose, her pulse hammering under his thumb. Years of silenced screams pressed against her throat. She wanted to fight back, but the weight of conditioning chained her still. Linda crossed her arms, her face cold. "Do not make this worse, Rachel," she said, her tone blaming, dismissive. The words cut deeper than Jason's grip. They were confirmation of what Rachel always knew: her mother would never defend her. Jason shoved her back, her body hitting the refrigerator with a dull thud. A plate slid from the counter and shattered on the tile shards, scattering like accusations. Rachel gasped, her chest tight, blood pounding in her ears. Jason towered over her, his shadow stretching across the kitchen floor. His voice dropped to a dangerous low. "Clean it." Rachel knelt, her hands trembling as she reached for the broken pieces. One shard sliced her palm, blood welling quickly. She hissed in pain but did not stop gathering the fragments while Jason smirked above her. "Look at you," he sneered. "Tough soldier cannot even handle dishes." Linda sighed, her voice flat. "Just apologize, Rachel. Stop making this worse." Rachel's hand shook, blood dripping onto the towel she grabbed from the counter. Her eyes filled with unshed tears, her chest heaving. For the first time in years, she said it aloud, a refusal that cracked through the silence like a gunshot. "No, I will not apologize." Jason's face contorted, rage vibrating through his entire body. His fists clenched his shoulders, tensed, his breath heavy with whiskey. Rachel braced herself, every muscle taut. Her army training whispered that she had endured worse, that she could survive, but this was not a battlefield. This was her home, and her enemy wore the face of her own brother. The standoff stretched, the tension crackling in the small kitchen until it felt unbearable. Finally, Jason stormed out, muttering curses, his heavy footsteps shaking the floorboards. The moment he left, Linda remained in the doorway, her eyes fixed on Rachel with cold judgment. "You never learn," she said quietly. "You push until he has no choice." Then she turned and walked away, leaving Rachel alone in the kitchen, surrounded by blood, broken porcelain, and silence. Rachel pressed her bleeding hand into a towel, the sting sharp and real. She whispered to herself, barely audible, but the words carried the truth she had always known. "He will kill me one day." The thought chilled her because she believed it. For years, she had endured insults, shoves, and blows. But tonight, something had shifted. The trigger had been small, just spilled soup and dirty dishes, but it revealed a truth she could no longer deny. In this house, her uniform meant nothing. Her service meant nothing. Her life meant nothing. She was not safe, and though she did not know it yet, the night would prove her whisper correct. The silence in the Whitman house after Jason stormed out was not relief. It was the quiet before a storm, heavy and suffocating, each second stretching like a warning. Rachel sat at the kitchen table, her injured hand wrapped in a towel, the faint metallic scent of blood mingling with the lingering aroma of soup. Her chest rose and fell in uneven breaths. She told herself that maybe it was over, that Jason had stomped off to drink in his room or leave the house entirely. But she knew better. Years of living under his shadow had taught her that when his rage was sparked, it rarely burned out quickly. It smoldered and returned hotter than before. The minutes passed, each one tightening Rachel's chest. She cleaned the fragments of the shattered plate, her hands shaking, the cut on her palm still bleeding through the towel. Her mother had retreated to the living room television, humming with artificial cheer, as though nothing had happened. That indifference carved deeper wounds than Jason's hand. Rachel whispered to herself, trying to steady her thoughts. Control your breathing. You can survive this. She had endured drills in the Carolina heat that pushed her body to collapse. She had run with a rucksack until her shoulders screamed. She had been told by her sergeant that pain meant you were alive, but this was different. The battlefield outside never prepared her for the battlefield inside her own home. It was close to 9 o'clock when Jason returned. Rachel heard the heavy thud of his boots on the stairs before she saw him. He re-entered the kitchen with a look that froze her blood. His eyes were darker, his steps deliberate, his right hand holding the thick leather belt he always wore. He let it dangle loosely at his side, the metal buckle glinting in the dim light. Rachel stood instinctively, her body tense, her injured hand pressed against her chest. "Jason, stop!" She said, her voice low but steady. He smirked, rolling his shoulders like a predator circling prey. "You think you can disrespect me in my own house? You think that uniform makes you more than me?" His words slurred but carried venom. Rachel stepped back, her shoulders brushing against the counter. "I said nothing wrong," she whispered. "I will not apologize." His smirk twisted into fury. In one sudden movement, he lifted the belt and swung it around her neck, the leather tightening in an instant. Rachel gasped, her hands flying up to grab the strap. The pressure on her throat was immediate, sharp crushing. Her breath caught, her eyes bulged, her body jolted with panic. Jason yanked harder, pulling her toward him as if she were no more than an object to be subdued. Her nails clawed at the belt, but his grip was iron. Her vision blurred at the edges, spots of light bursting behind her eyes. She tried to remember her training to stay calm, to find air, but survival instinct drowned everything. She thrashed her boots, scraping against the tile, her voice strangled into rasping gasps. Linda stood in the doorway, her arms crossed her face carved in stone. Rachel's gaze locked on her mother, pleading silently, begging for intervention. But Linda's lips curled into a cold line. "Maybe this will teach her?" she said flatly, the words slicing deeper than the leather. Rachel's chest convulsed, desperate for air. Her injured hand bled through the towel as she clawed at the belt, the sharp edges cutting into her fingers. Jason pulled tighter, his face flushed with rage and drink. Rachel's knees buckled, her body collapsing toward the floor. She hit the tile hard, her head snapping back, stars exploding in her vision. Jason did not release her. He knelt over her, pressing his weight down the belt taut. The sound of her gasps filled the kitchen, harsh and desperate, punctuated by the squeak of leather straining under pressure. She tried to scream, but only a choked whimper escaped. Her lungs screamed for air. Her eyes rolled back for a second before she forced them open again, staring up at the ceiling lights. Her drill sergeant's voice echoed in her memory. "Do not quit. Adapt. Overcome." She pushed against Jason with all the strength she had left, her body trembling violently. Her nails scratched at his hands, leaving streaks of red. For a moment, his grip faltered just slightly enough for a thin gasp of air to slip into her lungs. It burned like fire, but gave her another second. Jason snarled, tightening the belt again. Rachel's vision blurred fully now, her limbs going numb. She could feel herself slipping, her heartbeat pounding louder in her ears than anything else. She thought, "This is the end." But the human body fights hardest at the edge of death. With a sudden surge, Rachel twisted her body sideways, slamming her shoulder into Jason's knee. The movement startled him, loosening his grip just enough for her to drag in another ragged breath. She coughed violently, the sound raw and broken. Jason cursed, raising his fist. He slammed it into her side, the impact stealing what little air she had gained. Rachel groaned, the sound muffled by the belt. Her body curled instinctively, protecting her core. Linda's voice cut through again, calm, detached, almost cruel in its dismissal. "Do not resist him, Rachel. You always make things worse." The betrayal landed like a final blow. Rachel's mind screamed that she was alone, utterly abandoned. She felt the world dimming, darkness crowding and her muscles slackening. Jason dragged her by the belt toward the back door, the leather cutting deeper with every pull. He shoved the door open, the cold December air rushing in. Rachel's body hit the wooden deck, the icy boards burning her skin. She gasped faintly, the shock of cold mixing with suffocation. Jason hauled her across the yard, the frozen ground scraping against her arms and legs. In the far corner of the yard, the dog crate loomed rusted and forgotten, its padlock still hanging loosely on the latch. Rachel's heart pounded weakly, dread flooding her veins. She knew what was coming, and her fading strength screamed in panic. Jason yanked her upright, slammed her against the crate, and released the belt only long enough to shove her inside. She stumbled forward, her knees cracking against the icy metal floor, her palms slipping in blood and frost. Before she could turn, Jason kicked the door shut, the clang of steel reverberating in her bones. The padlock snapped into place with a sound that felt final. Rachel lunged at the bars, gripping them with trembling hands. Her breath rasped in shallow bursts, her chest heaving. "Please!" She choked out, her voice shredded. But her mother stood at the back steps, arms crossed, her figure lit by the warm glow from inside the house. Her expression was unreadable, her silence louder than any denial. Jason leaned close to the bars, his grin twisted. "Maybe this will teach you some respect." His breath reeked of whiskey, his eyes wild with satisfaction. Rachel's tears froze on her cheeks as she pressed her forehead against the bars, her body trembling violently. She could feel the cold seeping into her skin, the air inside the crate sharp and merciless. Her heart pounded weakly, her lungs burning from both the belt and the frigid night. She whispered to herself, "Pain means you are alive." She repeated it again and again, each time weaker, as Jason and Linda turned away and walked back into the warmth of the house. The door slammed shut, cutting her off from even the illusion of safety. Alone in the darkness locked in steel, Rachel felt the weight of years of abuse crash upon her. The escalation had reached its peak. The belt around her neck, the crate around her body, the betrayal carved into her soul. She was not just fighting her brother's strength anymore. She was fighting the legacy of a family that had decided her life was disposable. The December night in Fayetteville wrapped around the backyard like a predator, the temperature dropping below freezing, the damp air cutting into the skin as if the cold itself had claws. Inside the crate, Rachel Whitman curled into herself, the thin fabric of her Army PT uniform no match for the metal floor that stole her body heat with relentless hunger. Her chest still burned from the belt, each breath shallow and ragged, the skin of her throat raw and tender. Her hands trembled as she pressed them against the bars, blood from her palm, smearing on the steel, the sound of her gasps echoing back at her as though the cage mocked her struggle. She tried to steady her breathing, remembering the words of her drill sergeant at Fort Jackson. "Pain means you are alive. Adapt, overcome, endure." She whispered those words into the night, her voice hoarse and broken, the syllables dissolving into the icy air. But survival training in the wilderness had never prepared her for this. Out there, nature was the enemy, but at least it was impartial. Here, the enemy wore the face of her own brother and the indifference of her own mother. That betrayal cut deeper than the cold. The first half hour was nothing but shivering. Her body shook violently, her teeth rattling so loud it sounded like chains. She clenched her fists, trying to generate warmth, each movement sending sharp jolts of pain through her injured hand. The cold air sliced her lungs with every inhale, her breath fogging in front of her face in ragged bursts. She slammed her fists against the bars again and again, her knuckles reopening, fresh blood mixing with frost. "Help!" she rasped, but the sound was weak, swallowed by the night. From the house, she heard muffled laughter, the clink of glasses, the hum of the television. Life carried on for Jason and Linda, while hers ebbed away. Minutes bled into hours. The shivering grew less violent, and Rachel knew enough from her Army cold weather training to understand the danger. Hypothermia begins with uncontrolled shaking, but when the shaking stops, it is not relief. It is the body surrendering. She tried to force her muscles to keep moving, slamming her knees into the floor, clapping her hands together, anything to generate heat. But her limbs grew heavier, sluggish, as if the cold had wrapped chains around them. Her vision blurred, edges darkening. Memories began to intrude, vivid and sharp. She saw herself at 10, holding a spelling bee ribbon, only to watch Linda crumple it and toss it aside so Jason could have attention. She saw herself at 15, her shoulder bruised from Jason's shove, her mother insisting she apologize. She heard the phrase again echoing like a curse. Do not provoke your brother. Those words echoed louder than the wind, louder than her own heartbeat. The crate was not just a prison that night. It was the physical form of every year of silenced pain. She pressed her forehead to the bars, her tears freezing on her cheeks, tiny crystals clinging to her skin. Her lips moved with barely a whisper. I do not deserve this. The words disappeared into the cold. As her body weakened further, hallucinations bled into reality. She saw Fort Jackson's parade ground shimmering in summer heat, drill sergeants shouting cadence. She heard the pounding rhythm of boots, the voices of her unit chanting in unison. Left, right, left. She remembered the pride of wearing her uniform for the first time, the sense that she was no longer invisible. That pride felt distant now, like a dream dissolving into frost. She shivered once more violently, then the tremors stopped. Stillness settled into her muscles, the paradoxical warmth of late-stage hypothermia trickling through her veins. Her body tricked her into believing she was heating up. She clawed at her collar, pulling it away as if to cool herself even as her core temperature plummeted. She slid onto her side, her cheek pressing against the icy floor. The metal burned her skin, but she barely felt it. Her breaths came shallow, faint, barely enough to fog the air. Her heartbeat faltered heavy and uneven, like a drum losing rhythm. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked, the sound cutting through the night, but fading quickly into silence. Rachel whispered again, weaker now. Sergeant Miller! I am still here. Her voice cracked and fell away. Time became meaningless. Her body curled tighter, instinct fighting a battle already lost. She thought of Uncle Robert, who had once told her she deserved better. She thought of her fellow soldiers laughing in the chow hall. She thought of her mother's cold voice earlier in the kitchen. Maybe this will teach her, and the betrayal pierced her deeper than any fist or belt. Darkness folded over her heavy and absolute. Her heart stuttered, paused, then pounded weakly again. She drifted between memory and dream. She was back in the barracks hearing the alarm at dawn. She was back in the backyard locked in steel. Both realities collided until she no longer knew which was real. Her chest barely rose. Her fingers twitched against the bars one final time, leaving faint smears of blood that froze instantly. The world narrowed to silence. In the house next door, Robert Jenkins stirred in his sleep. A veteran himself, he knew the difference between ordinary family noise and something darker. Around 2:45, he stepped onto his back porch for firewood and thought he heard something metallic, a faint banging followed by silence. He frowned, unsettled. His wife Elaine whispered that maybe it was nothing, but Robert could not shake the feeling. At 11:30, he picked up the phone and called 911. His voice steady as he reported a disturbance in the Whitman yard. Within minutes, flashing lights broke the stillness of the street, red and blue strobes painting the houses. Police officers approached cautiously, flashlights cutting through the darkness. Their beams landed on the crate, the padlock gleaming, and inside, the pale, still form of Rachel curled unnaturally. An officer cursed, calling for bolt cutters. The lock snapped with a metallic crack, the door swung open, and the cold air rushed out like the exhale of a tomb. Rachel slid limply into their arms, her skin blue, her lips purple, her body stiff. No pulse, one EMT said sharply. They began compressions right there on the frost-covered grass, the sound of ribs creaking under pressure, the bag valve mask forcing air into lungs that had nearly surrendered. Her core temperature read 29 degrees Celsius, dangerously low survival, unlikely without intervention. They pushed epinephrine, their voices urgent but practiced. Come on, Private. Come back. Her body jerked under the force of chest compressions but remained limp. They lifted her into the ambulance, the sirens screaming as they sped toward Duke University Hospital in Durham, the stretcher rattling with every bump. Inside the back compartment, the EMTs shocked her heart, the defibrillator paddles pressing against her chest. Her body arched violently, the smell of ozone filling the air. The monitor flickered, then snapped back to flat. Another shock. Clear. Another arch, another fall. The screen mocked them with silence. For minutes that felt like hours, her heart refused to return. The paramedics shouted for warm IV fluids, blankets, anything to push back the cold. Finally, after a third jolt, the faintest tremor appeared on the screen. A fragile rhythm, irregular but alive. "We have a pulse!" The EMT shouted, his voice breaking with relief. But the victory was fragile. Rachel's eyelids fluttered once, lashes stiff with ice, and her lips parted. Her voice was barely audible, torn ragged by the belt in the cold. "He strangled me with a belt. My mom just watched." The words cut through the ambulance like a blade, freezing every person inside. They exchanged glances, stunned into silence. The sirens wailed louder, carrying her toward the hospital, carrying her away from death for the second time that night. The ambulance roared through the empty stretch of I-95 toward Durham, its sirens piercing the night, a desperate call cutting through the cold air. Inside the back compartment, Rachel Whitman's body lay on the stretcher, wrapped in blankets that did little against the frost that still clung to her hair and lashes. Her lips were cracked and purple, her skin pallid, her breaths forced by the rhythm of the bag valve mask squeezed by an EMT, whose forehead glistened with sweat despite the winter chill. The monitor above her flickered weakly, each irregular beat a fragile reminder that she was not yet gone. The EMTs worked in grim silence, punctuated by urgent commands. Epinephrine pushed, warm fluids running. Keep compressions steady. When they wheeled her through the automatic doors of Duke University Hospital, the sterile brightness of the emergency bay burned down on her body with cruel intensity, exposing every bruise, every mark on her throat, every cut on her hands. Nurses rushed forward, sneakers squeaking against tile as they pushed the gurney toward Trauma Room 3. Dr. Alan Cooper, the attending physician on call, leaned over immediately, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of the 19-year-old soldier who had already flatlined once. His voice was calm but clipped. "Core temperature, 29 degrees," a nurse called out. "Severe hypothermia. Her throat is bruised, consistent with strangulation," another nurse reported while fitting an oxygen mask over Rachel's face, the condensation fogging instantly. Dr. Cooper's jaw clenched. He had seen trauma before, but this combination of cold exposure and airway injury told a story darker than accident. He placed his stethoscope against her chest, listening for the faint, uneven rhythm. "Weak sinus tachycardia, but unstable." He nodded. "Keep warming her. Watch for arrhythmia. Get the defibrillator ready." His voice carried authority that steadied the room. A nurse slid heated blankets over Rachel's body, another fitted a warming device that pumped hot air across her chest. IV fluids flowed through her veins, their warmth fighting to bring back life. The smell of antiseptic mixed with the metallic tang of blood from her cracked lips. The monitor beeped weakly but held. For a moment the room stilled, as if waiting for permission to hope. Then Rachel's eyelids fluttered. Her lashes, stiff with frost, parted her gaze, unfocused at first, before fixing on the ceiling lights. Her throat convulsed, her voice raw, each word dragging out like gravel scraped across stone. "He strangled me with a belt. My mom just watched." The words were no louder than a whisper, but they cut through the room with surgical precision. Nurses froze pins, halted Dr. Cooper's eyes locked on her face. The weight of her confession pressed heavier than the flat line she had just escaped. For an instant, no one moved. Then Dr. Cooper leaned closer, his voice quiet but firm. "Private Whitman, can you hear me?" "You are safe here." His reassurance carried into her ears, but Rachel's gaze drifted heavy with exhaustion and shame. She coughed, the sound tearing at her bruised throat, and her eyes slid shut again, surrendering to unconsciousness. Dr. Cooper straightened his voice tight. "Document her words exactly." He turned to his team. "This is not an accident. Protect this girl." Nurses nodded, their faces set with new resolve. They adjusted leads, checked vitals, ensured the oxygen mask was secure. The heart monitor tapped out its fragile rhythm. Rachel's chest rose unevenly under the heated air. Outside the trauma room, the hall was a blur of motion stretchers, rolling voices calling codes. Yet within those walls, the weight of her whisper lingered heavier than any alarm. Hours blurred. Rachel drifted in and out of shallow consciousness, her body fighting the cold, her mind caught between nightmare and memory. Each time her eyes opened, she saw flashes of light, heard snippets of conversation, felt the tug of IV lines, but the image of the belt around her neck and the cold gaze of her mother never left. At dawn, the automatic doors slid open again. Jason and Linda walked in their presence, casting a shadow across the nurse's station. Jason's shoulders were squared with false bravado, his eyes bloodshot from drink and nerves. Linda wore a mask of maternal worry, so carefully arranged it might have fooled a stranger. She approached the desk, her voice syrupy. "We came as soon as we heard. She must have locked herself in by mistake. She has always been dramatic." Jason chimed in quickly, his tone smooth but his eyes darting. "She has been unstable since she joined the army. PTSD, maybe. You know how it is." One nurse frowned, her pen scratching against the chart, but she said nothing. Inside the trauma room, Rachel stirred, her lashes fluttering. Through the fog of her exhaustion, she heard their voices, familiar and poisonous, creeping into her mind. Her pulse quickened, not from the cold, but from fear. Her hand moved slowly beneath the blanket, fumbling until her fingers brushed the iPhone left on the bedside tray. With the last of her strength, she pressed record on the voice memo app and slid it under her pillow. Their lies would not vanish into thin air. Minutes later, Dr. Cooper entered, his eyes flicking from chart to patient to the two figures at the door. His voice was careful, professional, yet edged with suspicion. "Her injuries are not consistent with an accident. She has frostbite and blunt force trauma on her hands." Linda smiled tightly, adjusting her coat. "Dr. Young soldiers can be dramatic. She probably panicked and hurt herself." Jason nodded, shrugging. She always liked attention. Dr. Cooper's jaw tightened, but he held his tongue, simply writing down every word as evidence. An hour later, the door opened again, this time revealing a man in uniform. Sergeant James Miller from Fort Liberty stepped inside, his posture straight, his presence commanding. He had been notified through Army channels of one of his privates hospitalized under suspicious circumstances. His eyes swept the room, taking in the bruised soldier, the hovering family, the nurse charting quietly. He stepped to Rachel's bedside and spoke firmly. "Private Whitman, you are not alone. The Army takes family violence seriously. We will report this." Linda stiffened, her smile cracking. "Sergeant, this is a misunderstanding. My daughter has always had difficulties. The Army has made her worse." Miller ignored her, his attention fixed on Rachel. "Regulation requires family advocacy program involvement when a soldier is abused. CID will be informed." Rachel's chest tightened with relief, tears pricking her eyes. For the first time since the belt closed around her throat, she felt visible. Her lips moved weakly. "Thank you, Sergeant." Jason bristled, his fists clenching. "She is lying. She locked herself in just like Mom said." Miller turned to him with a gaze sharp enough to cut steel. "Then you should have no problem with an investigation, should you?" The silence that followed was louder than denial. Rachel's recorder captured every word. That evening, Detective Carla Henderson from Fayetteville Police arrived, clipboard in hand, her eyes sharp. She had worked dozens of domestic cases and knew fabrication when she smelled it. She asked Rachel careful questions, her pen poised. Rachel's throat burned, but she forced out the truth. "He strangled me with a belt." My mother watched. Henderson's expression stayed neutral, but her pen moved swiftly. She turned to Linda and Jason, who protested in unison. "She is confused. She does not know what she is saying." Henderson raised an eyebrow. "We will let the evidence speak." Her tone was final. Hours later, Linda returned alone, slipping into the dim room. She leaned close, her voice sugar-laced with steel. "You must not make this into something it is not. People are already whispering. If you insist on these wild stories, it will destroy this family. Think about me. Think about Jason. Think about our name." Rachel stared at her, silent, letting the recorder beneath her pillow capture every poisonous word. Linda straightened, her eyes flashing cold. "If you betray this family, you will regret it." She turned and walked out, her heels clicking down the hall. Rachel's pulse raced, but for the first time it was not only fear, it was defiance. She pressed her hand against the recorder, reassuring herself that the truth was no longer just hers to carry. It was preserved, multiplied, ready to fight back. She was still weak, still wrapped in heated blankets, still scarred by the belt around her neck, But in that moment, she knew the war had shifted. The silence that had once nearly killed her was now breaking. Her confession, captured in whispers and recordings, was no longer a secret. It was evidence, and evidence could not be silenced. Morning light spilled through the narrow windows of Duke University Hospital, but inside Trauma Room 3, the fluorescent glare never dimmed. Machines hummed, the heart monitor beeped with fragile regularity, and Rachel Whitman lay bundled in heated blankets, her body trembling less now but still weak. Her lips were chapped, her throat lined with bruises, her hands wrapped in gauze. She stared at the ceiling with eyes that seemed older than 19 eyes that had watched death pass over her twice in one night. She had whispered her truth and she had hidden her recorder, but the battle ahead was only beginning. At 8 o'clock, Dr. Alan Cooper entered with a typed report in hand. His voice was clinical but carried weight. Her injuries are consistent with strangulation. The bruising on the neck is patterned circular, exactly matching a belt strap. Hypothermia at arrival core temperature 29 degrees Celsius indicates prolonged exposure. Lacerations on the hands show blunt trauma from striking a hard surface repeatedly. These findings are not consistent with accidental entrapment. He handed the report to Detective Carla Henderson, who had returned to the hospital with deliberate steps, her dark coat trailing behind her. Henderson read carefully each line, confirming what Rachel had whispered. She looked up at the doctor, her tone steady. "This matches what she told me." Then she turned to Rachel, her expression softening. "You have allies, Private. Do not forget that." Rachel swallowed her throat raw, but her eyes held gratitude. The detective leaned closer. "We will move forward, but we need everything you remember." Rachel forced herself upright slightly, her voice hoarse but unwavering. "He pushed me down in the kitchen. He wrapped a belt around my neck. My mother said maybe this will teach her. Then he dragged me outside, locked me in the crate. I thought I was going to die." Henderson's pen moved swiftly, each word etched into the record. She asked Rachel to describe the crate, the lock, the sequence of events. Rachel spoke slowly, carefully, her memory sharp despite exhaustion. She described the rusted bars, the master lock snapping shut, the frozen air pressing against her chest. She lifted her bandaged hands with effort. Even through antiseptic wraps, the bruises and lacerations were visible. Henderson photographed them, each click of the camera a nail in the coffin of Linda and Jason's lies. Rachel winced under the flash, but forced her hands steady. Evidence was the only weapon that mattered now. Later that day, Sergeant James Miller returned from Fort Liberty, his uniform crisp, his posture unyielding. He carried with him another soldier specialist, Aaron Lopez, an Army IT technician. Miller's voice was calm but firm. "We are backing you. Regulation requires family advocacy program involvement when a soldier is abused. CID has been informed. You are not alone." Rachel's chest tightened, tears welling, but this time they were not from despair. Lopez pulled a small laptop from his bag, set it on the rolling tray, and gently took Rachel's phone. With careful hands, he copied the recordings to multiple encrypted drives. "We will store these on base servers," he explained. "If they try to take your phone or erase it, the evidence will remain." Rachel closed her eyes briefly, relief flooding her. Years of silence had taught her that words vanished too easily, but now every word was preserved, multiplied, shielded. For the first time, the balance tilted in her favor. That evening, Robert Jenkins, the neighbor who had called 911, and visited with his wife Elaine. Robert's weathered face carried both relief and anger. He sat beside her bed, his voice steady. "I heard you pounding that night. I heard your mother say maybe this will teach her. I knew something was wrong. I will testify." Elaine nodded, her hand resting gently on Rachel's shoulder. "We believe you. We always wondered about that house. Now we know." Rachel's throat ached, her voice cracked, but she whispered thank you. The confirmation struck her harder than the belt had. For years, she had been told she was dramatic, unstable, provoking him. Now a neighbor's words pierced that lie and replaced it with truth. Henderson gathered every piece. Photographs of bruises, medical reports, recordings, witness statements. She explained patiently. "The law can be slow, but with this much detail and public pressure, they cannot bury it. We will pursue charges." Rachel nodded, determination sparking through her weakness. "I will not let them silence me again." Over the next days, the hospital became less a place of healing and more a fortress of evidence. Nurses whispered about the young soldier who had been locked in a crate. Doctors wrote detailed notes. Every visitor was monitored. Each time Linda or Jason attempted to visit, they were logged, their words carefully captured on Rachel's hidden recorder. One evening, they returned together, Linda's tone sweet for anyone listening but sharp in Rachel's ears. "Just tell them you were tired. Say you locked yourself in by mistake." Jason smirked, adding, "You scared us, little sister. Stop making a scene." Rachel remained silent, letting the recorder beneath her pillow capture everything. When they left, her pulse raced not from fear, but from triumph. Every word was ammunition. Lopez returned the next day to back up the new recordings, nodding with quiet approval. "You are building a case they cannot ignore." Meanwhile, Miller coordinated with Army legal channels. He explained to Rachel that the Family Advocacy Program would provide safe housing and counseling. If she needed distance from her family, the Army would ensure it. "You are a soldier," he reminded her. "We do not leave our own behind." Rachel's eyes burned with tears. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of belonging not to a family that betrayed her, but to an institution that would stand with her. Detective Henderson prepared the groundwork for arrest, but she wanted the confrontation to happen in public, where no manipulation could be spun in shadows. She spoke quietly with Robert and Elaine, and together they planned a gathering. A dinner that seemed ordinary but would become the stage for revelation. While plans formed outside Rachel's body continued to heal. Her frost-bitten fingers throbbed, wrapped in careful dressings. Her throat remained raw, her voice still weak, but each day she grew stronger. She began to sit up to eat small meals, to speak longer sentences. Yet, each night nightmares dragged her back to the crate, the sound of the padlock snapping shut her mother's cold words. She woke, drenched in sweat, whispering to herself, "I am still here." Nurses noticed the fire returning to her eyes. "She is not just surviving," one whispered to another. "She is preparing for battle." The room filled with visitors who formed an unlikely coalition. A doctor, a detective, a sergeant, a technician, a neighbor. Each held a strand of truth, and together they wove a net too strong for Linda and Jason to break. Rachel understood now what her drill sergeant had meant when he said, "No soldier fights alone." Alone, she had been vulnerable. Together, she was unstoppable. One evening, as the machines beeped softly beside her, Rachel whispered into the recorder with steady conviction, "This is not the end. This is the beginning." Her voice, still rough, carried more strength than any shout. The evidence was no longer hidden in whispers or buried in bruises. It was gathered, preserved, ready. The silence that had once nearly killed her had transformed into her greatest weapon. The war for truth had already begun, and for the first time she knew she would not fight it alone. The winter air in Fayetteville carried a sharp bite when Robert and Elaine Jenkins opened their modest home on Sycamore Street for what neighbors believed would be a quiet dinner to celebrate Rachel Whitman's survival. The long wooden table was set with collard greens, cornbread, fried chicken, and sweet tea, the familiar staples of Southern gatherings that brought comfort to the community. Word had spread quickly through the neighborhood that Rachel, the young soldier who had nearly died, would attend. Some came out of genuine care, others drawn by curiosity, but by 6 in the evening the Jenkins living room was full of murmurs, coats hung on racks, boots stamped free of snow. Rachel sat quietly at one end of the table, dressed not in fatigues, but in a plain blouse and slacks, her frostbitten hands still wrapped in gauze, her posture straight despite the weight in her chest. She was nervous, her breath shallow, but she repeated to herself the cadence her drill sergeant had once shouted. "Pain means you are alive. Truth means you are free." Across the room, reporters from the Fayetteville Observer adjusted their cameras, expecting a simple human interest story about a soldier's miraculous recovery. They did not realize they were about to witness something far more explosive. At a few minutes past 7, the door opened again, and Linda Whitman entered, sweeping into the room with the air of a woman confident she could control the narrative. Her coat was neat, her hair styled, her smile practiced. Jason followed close behind. His face, flushed, his shoulders hunched, but his eyes gleaming with defiance. Conversations hushed as the two took their seats at the far end of the table. Rachel's pulse quickened. For years, their presence had meant silence, But tonight, she was armed with truth. Robert Jenkins rose and tapped his glass with a fork, his voice strong and steady. "Thank you all for coming. Tonight, we honor Private First Class Rachel Whitman's recovery. More importantly, we honor truth." Eyes turned toward Rachel. She swallowed hard, her bandaged hands trembling slightly as she pushed back her chair and stood. For a moment, her voice faltered, then grew steady. "For years, I was told my pain did not matter. 2 weeks ago, that silence nearly killed me." She reached for the small remote hidden in her lap. The television in the corner flickered on its screen, filling the room with sound. The first voice was Jason's, low and threatening, captured in her hospital room. "If she talks, we are finished." Gasps rippled through the guests. Rachel's gaze locked on Jason's face, his expression twisting as the evidence echoed through the room. The next recording followed Linda's cold voice, unmistakable. "If you betray this family, you will regret it." Murmurs rose, neighbors shifting in their seats, eyes wide with shock. Linda's smile froze her wine glass, trembling slightly in her hand. She tried to laugh, her voice cracking. "That is taken out of context." Jason lurched forward, his voice rising. "Lies. She is lying." But Rachel was not finished. On the screen appeared photographs of her frostbitten hands, bruised neck, and pale face taken in the hospital. Then the words of Dr. Cooper's report appeared in bold letters. "Injuries consistent with strangulation. Core temperature 29 degrees at arrival. Blunt trauma on hands from striking steel. No possibility of accident." The room fell into silence heavier than stone. No one could explain away the clinical language of a physician. At the far end of the table, Rachel's cousin Ruby lifted her phone, showing the live stream already running on Facebook. Thousands of viewers were watching, comments pouring in. "Lock them up! How could a mother do this? Soldier deserves justice." Linda's face drained of color as realization dawned that the narrative she had controlled for years was being torn apart live before the eyes of the community. Jason surged to his feet, his fists clenched, but 2 neighbors blocked him firmly. "Sit down," one said. "This is not your house." Linda tried again, her voice shrill. "She is sick. She does not know what she is saying." Rachel stepped closer to the camera, her bandaged hands trembling but her voice steady. "I am not sick. I am not confused. I am a soldier who survived being strangled by my brother while my mother watched, and I will not be silent anymore." Gasps erupted, then voices, then shouts. Anger swept the room like a storm, decades of suspicion about the Whitman household exploding into certainty. Outside, headlights flashed. Police cars pulled up, red and blue lights splashing across the snow. The door opened with authority as Detective Carla Henderson entered, her coat dusted with frost, her badge gleaming under the light. She scanned the room, her eyes landing on Jason and Linda. "We need to talk." Jason spat curses, trying to push past, but officers moved quickly, restraining him with firm hands. Linda clutched her coat, her voice breaking. "This is family business." Henderson's reply was cold steel. "Attempted murder is not family business." Cameras rolled, microphones thrust forward. Reporters captured every second as Jason and Linda were led toward the waiting patrol cars. Neighbors pressed closer, their voices rising in a chant that spilled out into the freezing night. "Lock them up! Lock them up!" Rachel stood trembling, not from fear, but from release. Her body still bore the scars of the belt and the frost, but her voice had become unbreakable. She turned to the live stream still running on Ruby's phone. "The crate did not bury me. It freed me." Her words spread instantly, carried across thousands of screens, echoed in the comments of strangers who cheered her defiance. The flashing lights outside painted the snow red and blue. Jason's curses faded as the car door slammed. Linda's pleas melted into the night air. Inside the Jenkins home, silence fell for a moment, as if everyone needed to absorb what had just happened. Then applause broke out, hesitant at first, then swelling into a roar that shook the walls. Rachel stood in the center, tears streaming down her cheeks, overwhelmed not by pain, but by the strange sensation of being seen, believed, and defended. She whispered to herself words that would later echo in court and on television screens. Silence is not survival. That night, Fayetteville no longer whispered about the Whitman family. The truth had been dragged into the open, and once in the light, it could not be buried again. Rachel had delivered her confrontation not in private, but before neighbors, reporters, officers, and thousands watching online. The silence that had nearly killed her had finally shattered, and the sound of its breaking was louder than any siren. The gray stone facade of the Cumberland County Courthouse in Fayetteville loomed against the pale winter sky 2 months after the night Rachel Whitman nearly died. On the morning of the trial, the steps were lined with reporters clutching microphones, cameras on tripods, and neighbors who had once passed the Whitman home in silence, but now held hand-painted signs that read, "Justice for Rachel and silence is not survival." The chill in the air did not keep them away. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was electric, a tension that seemed to thrum in every hallway. Journalists whispered updates into cameras, advocates for domestic abuse. Survivors clustered in groups, and soldiers from Fort Liberty arrived in uniform to show support for their fellow private. Rachel entered through the front doors, flanked by Sergeant James Miller on one side and Robert Jenkins on the other. She wore her pressed Army service uniform, the insignia gleaming against the dark fabric. Though the frostbite scars on her hands were still visible, her posture was straight and unyielding, every step a declaration that she was no longer the invisible daughter. When she stepped into the packed courtroom, the murmur of voices hushed. The jury sat attentive. The judge presided with solemn eyes, and at the defense table, Jason sat hunched with a permanent scowl, his bulk straining against his suit jacket. Beside him, Linda appeared, polished. Her hair styled her expression carefully composed, but her eyes flickered nervously. Their attorneys shuffled papers and whispered hurriedly, but the weight of evidence already hung heavy. The prosecution opened with precision, laying out the timeline of that December night, projecting images of Rachel's frostbitten hands and neck bruises, reading excerpts from Dr. Alan Cooper's medical report. His calm voice echoed in the courtroom as he testified. Her core temperature was 29 degrees Celsius. Most patients do not return from that. The bruising on the neck is patterned exactly like a belt strap. The injuries to her hands indicate repeated trauma from striking steel. These findings are not consistent with accident. The jury scribbled notes, their eyes cutting toward Jason. Next came Robert Jenkins, his weathered voice steady as he recounted hearing metallic pounding from the yard. Then Linda's voice saying, "Maybe this will teach her." Elaine Jenkins confirmed it, her quiet testimony carrying weight. "We heard her. We could not ignore it. For years we had suspected, but that night there was no doubt. Then came the Army." Sergeant Miller testified firmly about the regulation requiring family advocacy program involvement. He explained how the Army had supported Rachel with counseling and housing, how her service was consistent and honorable. His words framed Rachel not as a troubled girl, but as a soldier worthy of protection. Specialist Aaron Lopez followed, presenting the copied audio recordings, playing them aloud for the courtroom. Jason's voice thundered from the speakers. "If she talks, we are finished." Linda's icy warning filled the room. "If you betray this family, you will regret it." Gasps erupted in the gallery, reporters scribbling furiously, some shaking their heads. The defense objected, but the judge overruled. The evidence was too direct. Finally, it was Rachel's turn. She rose from her seat and walked to the stand. Every eye followed her. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. Her voice wavered slightly at first, then steadied. She described the kitchen argument, the soup spilled, Jason's rage, the belt tightening around her throat. She described her mother standing nearby and saying, "Maybe this will teach her." She recounted being dragged outside, locked in the crate, the cold creeping into her body until her heart stopped. Her words were blunt, stripped of embellishment, delivered like a soldier reporting after battle. The defense attorney pressed, suggesting stress from Army life had confused her memory, but Rachel met his gaze steadily. "I may have been frozen, but my mind was clear. I know who strangled me and I know who watched." The jury shifted, their expressions hardening. Then came the recordings, again louder this time, played for emphasis. The jury leaned forward, hearing the threat, and the cold warning, seeing Rachel's battered photographs projected alongside. The defense tried to argue context, claiming the voices were misunderstood, but the combination of medical evidence, eyewitness testimony, and direct recordings was overwhelming. Reporters scribbled notes. Soldiers in the gallery nodded grimly. Advocates for survivors clasped each other's hands. After 2 weeks of testimony, the trial reached its conclusion. The jury deliberated less than a single day. When they returned, the foreperson stood with the verdict slips in hand, her voice steady. On the charge of attempted murder, we find the defendant Jason Whitman guilty. On the charge of complicity and obstruction, we find the defendant Linda Whitman guilty. A gasp swept through the room, then silence, then a ripple of relieved murmurs. Jason's face twisted in rage, his fists clenching, but deputies stepped closer. Linda's shoulders slumped, her mask of composure collapsing into despair. The judge's voice was firm, resonating through the chamber. Jason Whitman, you are sentenced to 20 years in state prison. Linda Whitman, you are sentenced to 10 years for complicity and obstruction. Family is meant to protect, not destroy. This court will not allow violence to hide behind the word family. The gavel struck final and decisive. Tears filled Rachel's eyes, but they were not of sorrow. They were tears of release, of vindication after years of silence. She looked toward Robert and Elaine, who nodded with pride toward Sergeant Miller, who gave a firm nod toward the soldiers who stood in quiet solidarity. Reporters flooded the courthouse steps as Jason was led away in handcuffs, shouting curses drowned by the crowd outside. Linda walked silently, her head bowed, her name and reputation in ashes. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward, the crowd chanting justice for Rachel. When Rachel stepped out into the cold air, the cheer rose like a wave. She paused on the steps, breath visible in the frosty morning, and spoke clearly into the microphones. Justice means silence no longer protects the abuser. Justice means survivors are not invisible. Justice means I survived not only the belt, but the silence of those who should have loved me. Her words replayed across television screens that evening, anchors shaking their heads at the cruelty but praising her resilience. National outlets picked up the story headlines reading, "Soldier Survives, Strangulation by Family. Soldier Wins Justice in Fayetteville Courtroom." Advocates cited her case as proof of the danger of silence. On Fort Liberty, Rachel was welcomed back by her unit with quiet pride. Sergeant Miller clasped her shoulder. "You are still standing, Private. That is what matters." Counselors arranged therapy, chaplains offered support. Fellow soldiers checked in on her barracks. She was no longer just another private. She was a symbol. For Fayetteville, for the Army, for survivors. The courthouse battle was over, but her war for healing was only beginning. Yet as she walked across the parade field at dawn a week later, frost crunching beneath her boots, she felt lighter. The cadence of her platoon echoed across the field. Left, right, left. She took her place at the front, her voice strong. "I survived the belt. I survived the night. Now I lead myself." The chant picked up behind her, echoing into the Carolina morning, a rhythm not just of survival, but of victory. The trial was over, but for Rachel Whitman the scars remained both visible and hidden. After Jason and Linda were sentenced, the Army immediately placed her in temporary housing near Fort Liberty, a small 2-bedroom apartment on the edge of Fayetteville. The walls were bare at first, but to Rachel, even their emptiness felt like freedom, because for the first time in 19 years, she could shut a door and know it would not open with rage behind it. She filled the silence with small things that belonged only to her. A potted plant by the window, a quilt folded on the couch, books she had long wanted to read stacked on a shelf. Each object was a declaration that this space was hers, not her mother's, not her brother's. The Army Family Advocacy Program arranged counseling sessions, and Rachel went reluctantly at first. She had been taught as a soldier to grit her teeth and push through, but the therapist reminded her that survival was not just about endurance, it was about healing. In their sessions, Rachel spoke haltingly of the belt, the crate, the words, "maybe this will teach her," and the silence that had once suffocated her more than the cold. Slowly, she began to unpack the years of conditioning that told her she did not matter. Therapy was not easy. Nightmares jolted her awake, the sound of the padlock snapping shut echoing in her ears. She would wake, drenched in sweat, clutching her chest, convinced for a moment that she was still trapped. But each time she whispered aloud, "I am free," and each time the walls of her own apartment reminded her she was safe. The nightmares became less frequent, though they never disappeared. Robert and Elaine Jenkins visited often, bringing food or simply sitting at her kitchen table with cups of sweet tea. They treated her not as a victim, but as family, Elaine fussed over her bandaged hands. Robert told stories from his years in the service, and together they filled her apartment with warmth that she had never known in her mother's house. Rachel began calling them her second family, and they accepted the title with quiet pride. One evening, Robert said, "You are our daughter now," and the words made Rachel's eyes fill with tears. At Fort Liberty, her fellow soldiers rallied around her as well. They did not press her for details, but they made sure she was never isolated. They invited her to meals at the chow hall, pulled her into morning runs, and reminded her that she belonged to a squad that valued her strength. When she faltered on a long march, her battle buddy whispered, "You carried us once, we carry you now." And those words anchored her. Slowly her body healed. The frostbite scars on her fingers faded to a bluish discoloration, but she regained full use. The bruises around her neck lightened, then disappeared, though the memory of pressure never left. She began training again in the gym, first light exercises, then heavier routines, each repetition a reclaiming of her body from the violence it had endured. Cooking, which had once been forced servitude at her mother's stove, became a quiet act of healing. In her apartment, Rachel experimented with recipes she had seen in the barracks or learned from neighbors. She cooked not because she had to, but because she chose to. She invited Robert and Elaine over for dinners of chicken pot pie or shrimp and grits, laughing when Elaine declared she cooked better than most restaurants in town. Each shared meal was a reminder that food could be about care and community, not punishment. As months passed, Rachel began to speak publicly about her experience. At first, it was small groups organized by the Army chaplain gatherings of soldiers and spouses who had faced domestic abuse. Rachel told them silence is not survival. She described how her neighbor's choice to call 911 saved her life, how evidence broke the cycle of gaslighting, and how chosen family could replace the ones who betrayed you. Her voice trembled, but each time she spoke, it grew stronger. Soon, she accepted invitations to speak at community centers in Fayetteville, then at survivor advocacy events in Raleigh and Durham. Older women and men approached her afterward with tears in their eyes, telling her they had stayed silent for years and that her story gave them courage. She kept their letters in a box, reading them when doubt returned. Healing was not linear. Some days she felt invincible leading her platoon on a morning run, her voice carrying cadence across the frosty field. Other days she sat on her balcony staring at the horizon, unable to shake the echo of her mother's cold voice. But she learned to measure progress not in the absence of pain, but in her ability to keep moving despite it. 6 months after the trial, Rachel hosted a gathering in her apartment. Soldiers from her unit neighbors Robert and Elaine all crowded into the small space. She served homemade barbecue and cornbread, and when laughter filled the room, she felt a surge of gratitude so strong it brought tears. Looking around, she realized she had built a chosen family out of people who had no obligation to her except care. That night, she raised a glass and said to survival, to truth, to freedom. Glasses clinked and the sound echoed like a benediction. The Army recognized her resilience formally as well. During a unit ceremony, Sergeant Miller commended her for embodying loyalty, duty, respect, and courage. The applause that followed was not the thunder of battle, but it was enough to make Rachel's chest swell with pride. She was no longer defined by the belt or the crate. She was defined by her refusal to remain silent. She carried that identity into everything she did. When younger soldiers confided struggles, she listened carefully. When a neighbor whispered about a controlling spouse, she handed them a hotline number. She had become not just a survivor, but an advocate. On the anniversary of the night she nearly died, Rachel returned to the Jenkins home. They sat around at the same table where she had once confronted her mother and brother. This time, there was no tension, only warmth. Elaine served cornbread again. Robert poured sweet tea, and Rachel smiled genuinely. She whispered quietly, this time, "I am not afraid of the night anymore." They nodded, understanding. Later that evening, she stood on her balcony, watching the lights of Fayetteville twinkle. She whispered into the cool air, "I am alive. I am free. I am not invisible." The wind carried her words not to silence, but to a world that now knew her story. The morning air over Fort Liberty was sharp with frost as Rachel Whitman laced her boots and stepped onto the parade field. It had been almost a year since the night she had collapsed in her neighbor's yard. Her heartbeat flatlined, her lips blue. That morning, she stood tall, her uniform crisp, the Army insignia shining against the dawn. Around her, the platoon formed ranks waiting for the run to begin. The cadence started, low boots striking in unison, breath fogging in the air. Rachel's voice rose above the rhythm, strong and steady. I survived the belt. I survived the night. Now I lead myself. The soldiers behind her picked it up, their voices carrying across the frosty field, echoing against the barracks and tree line. Left, right, left. Her words were no longer just about survival, but about leadership, about reclaiming her identity. As they ran, she felt the rhythm of her heart in sync with every boot strike, a reminder that life had been returned to her and she had chosen to live it fully. After the run, a reporter approached her, microphone in hand. Cameras captured her breath, still visible in the cold morning air. What does justice mean to you, Private Whitman? She did not hesitate. Justice means silence no longer protects the abuser. Justice means survivors are not invisible. Justice means I survived not only the belt, but the silence of those who should have loved me. The words replayed that evening on television screens across North Carolina, then on national networks, anchors shaking their heads at the cruelty of her past, but praising the resilience of her present. Her story traveled further than she had imagined, reaching homes where survivors sat in silence and wondered if their own truths could ever be heard. Rachel received letters and messages, some from strangers across the country, others from veterans who had faced violence in their families, others from women and men in their 50s or 60s who had carried secrets for decades. One wrote, I left my husband today because you gave me the push I needed. Another wrote, my daughter told me her truth after seeing your interview. Rachel kept the letters in a small wooden box, each one a reminder that her pain had become a beacon. The Army continued to support her with therapy, housing, and mentorship, but her true strength came from the community she built. Robert and Elaine Jenkins remained her second family. She ate dinner with them at least once a week, and each visit was filled with warmth rather than tension. She cooked meals for them in her apartment, turning what had once been an act of servitude into an act of love. Together they celebrated holidays, birthdays, and anniversaries, filling the gaps that her birth family had left with unconditional support. Healing did not erase the scars, but it transformed them. The faint discoloration on her fingers and the memory of the belt around her neck became part of her story, not as marks of weakness, but as symbols of survival. When she spoke at advocacy events in Raleigh or Durham, she held up her hand and said, "Scars can be evidence, but they can also be testimony." The audience, often filled with people over 50 who had lived through their own silent wounds, leaned in as she told them, silence is not survival. She reminded them that courage has no expiration date, that it can be found at 19 or at 70. She urged them to break their own silences, to call out cruelty, to support neighbors, to make the single phone call that might save a life. Each time she spoke, she saw heads nod, tears fall, and hands clasped together in solidarity. A year after the trial, Rachel stood on the steps of the Cumberland County Courthouse, once again, this time not as a victim testifying, but as a speaker at a rally for domestic abuse survivors. The crowd filled the square, banners held high, chants echoing against the courthouse walls. She stepped up to the podium, her uniform crisp, her gaze steady. My name is Private First Class Rachel Whitman. I was strangled by my brother while my mother watched. I was left to die in the cold. But I am still here. I am here because a neighbor chose not to stay silent. I am here because evidence was stronger than lies. I am here because silence is not survival. The crowd erupted in applause chants, rising louder. Reporters captured the moment, broadcasting it to living rooms across America. That night, survivors from every generation saw her stand firm, and many found their own voices. After the rally, Rachel walked back to her apartment. She stood on her balcony overlooking Fayetteville, the lights twinkling below Fort Liberty's silhouette etched against the horizon. She whispered into the air, I am alive. I am free. I am not afraid of the night anymore. The wind carried her words outward, not to silence, but to others who needed to hear them. In that moment, Rachel knew her story was not just about her survival, but about the survival of countless others who had been taught to remain invisible. For those listening now, especially those over 50 who have carried secrets in silence, Rachel's message is simple. Have you ever witnessed injustice in your family? Did you stay silent or did you speak? Your story matters. Your truth deserves air. Silence only protects cruelty. Speak your truth. Share your story. Do not let regret be the companion of your later years. One act of courage, one phone call, one refusal to stay silent can save a life. Rachel survived the belt. She survived the cold. She survived the silence. Now she invites you to join her. Comment below with your story. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you believe silence should never protect cruelty. Together we can build a world where no one is locked away unseen.